ChatGPT. The night feels different when everything else has gone quiet. Not empty, just open. It's the kind of quiet where thoughts don't rush to explain themselves. They arrive slowly. They sit beside you. What if the first civilizations were not announcing the beginning of humanity, but trying to remember something that had already slipped away? That idea tends to surface at night, when certainty feels less important than presence. Before we go further, if you enjoy these quiet reflections where history refuses to fully explain itself, consider subscribing. And if you're listening somewhere in the dark, feel free to leave a comment saying where you are and what time it is. I like imagining these thoughts moving quietly across time zones. There's something unsettling about how suddenly the first civilizations appear in the historical record. Cities with streets already planned, calendars already measuring the sky, writing already capable of recording law, trade, and memory. In southern Mesopotamia, the earliest Sumerian cities emerge around the 4th millennium BCE. Uruk, Eridu, Lagash. Archaeology shows mud brick walls, irrigation systems, administrative tablets. Not experiments, not rough drafts, finished systems. It makes you wonder why history looks that way. Civilizations, we're told, are supposed to grow slowly. Villages become towns. Towns become cities. Mistakes are made. Techniques are refined. But in Sumer, refinement seems to arrive already intact. The writing system appears complex from its earliest examples. The mathematics uses a base 60 system that still shapes how we measure time today. The legal and administrative records show an understanding of organization that feels practiced, not new. And yet, the records rarely describe invention. They don't say, "This is when we first learned to do this." They don't explain how these systems were discovered. They simply use them. That absence feels quiet but persistent. What if that silence isn't accidental? What if the first civilizations weren't standing at the start of a story, but somewhere in the middle? One possibility is that earlier stages existed, but time erased them. Flooding along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers could have buried older settlements beneath layers of silt. Organic materials decay, wood disappears. Only stone and fired clay remain. If that's the case, then what we see as sudden may simply be what survived. But there's another possibility. What if knowledge doesn't always leave behind its learning process? What if skills refined over generations were passed on through practice, not explanation? Taught by doing, remembered by repetition. In that case, when writing finally appears, it wouldn't record discovery. It would record continuity. A third possibility feels quieter, but heavier. What if the people who first wrote things down believed they were restoring something older? Sumerian texts often describe kingship as something that descended, temples as something that was rebuilt, order as something that was returned. Those words don't feel like beginnings, they feel like recovery. There's something unsettling about that language. It suggests memory without context, as if the knowledge was there. But the story of how it came to be was already fading. At night, that idea feels familiar. We remember how to do things long after we forget why we learned them. Habits outlive explanations. Routines survive loss. Civilizations may remember the same way. If something disruptive happened before writing existed, a flood, a climate shift, a collapse of earlier networks, then memory might survive unevenly. Details lost, practices preserved. Writing would arrive not at the moment of discovery, but at the moment when forgetting became a real fear. Clay doesn't forget easily. Once a mark is pressed into it and fired, it lasts. Longer than voices, longer than stories told at night. What if the earliest tablets weren't meant to explain the world, but to make sure something didn't disappear again? That would change how we read them, not as declarations of origin, but as anchors, ways of holding on. At night, anchors matter more than answers. We don't need to know where the darkness began to rest inside it. We only need to feel that something is holding steady. Maybe the first civilizations felt the same. They built cities not to celebrate a beginning, but to prevent another ending. If that's true, then the question shifts. Instead of asking, why did civilization begin so suddenly? We might ask, what happened before that made continuity so important? And what if the answer isn't written down because it couldn't be? What if the people who remembered it never learned to write? And the people who learned to write only inherited the aftermath? That would leave us with a record that feels confident but incomplete. Precise, but quiet. A civilization that knows how to continue, but no longer knows exactly where it came from. There's something strangely human about that. We move forward carrying things we didn't choose, using tools we didn't invent, trusting systems whose origins we rarely question. History might be doing the same thing. Tonight we don't need to decide whether any of this is true. I'm not here to prove anything, only to think with you. To notice how the silence in the record feels, and how often it points backward without explaining itself. What if the first civilizations weren't inventing history, but trying to remember it before it slipped away completely? The quiet stretches a little longer now, not empty, just patient. It's the kind of silence where the past doesn't feel distant. It feels nearby, almost listening back. When archaeologists first uncovered the earliest Sumerian tablets, they expected simplicity. Early attempts, crude symbols. Instead, they found records of accounting, land management, temple offerings, lists, systems. Not stories about discovery, stories about maintenance. That detail tends to linger when you sit with it long enough, because maintenance implies something already established. Irrigation canals mapped and regulated, fields measured, rations calculated. These aren't the tools of a society just learning how to survive. They're the tools of a society trying to stay stable. And stability usually comes after something has gone wrong. It makes you wonder what kind of memory would motivate that focus. The Sumerians wrote about floods often, not metaphorically, practically. Water was both life and threat in Mesopotamia. Seasonal flooding enriched the soil, but uncontrolled flooding erased settlements. Archaeology confirms that around the early 3rd millennium BCE, several Sumerian cities were interrupted by major flood deposits. Layers of clean silt separating one phase of occupation from another. Before, after. The people who returned rebuilt on top of what remained. What if that pattern didn't begin there? What if flooding wasn't just a local problem, but part of a longer remembered instability? In later texts, Sumerian myths describe a time before a great flood, followed by a world reorganized afterward. Kingship descends again. Order is restored. It's tempting to treat that as symbolic. A story about chaos and renewal, but at night symbolism doesn't feel like enough. Stories that last usually carry something heavier, something people don't want to lose. What if the flood stories weren't about divine punishment or cosmic drama, but about continuity breaking, about systems that worked until they didn't? If an earlier network of settlements existed, smaller, scattered, coastal, river-based, rising waters could have erased them unevenly. Some places gone entirely, others partially damaged. Survivors would carry fragments, techniques, habits, not blueprints. When they rebuilt, they wouldn't say, "We invented this." They would say, "This is how it's done." And when writing finally arrived, it would capture the doing, not the remembering. There's something unsettling about how rarely early texts explain origins. They name gods, they list kings, they describe rituals, but they almost never describe first moments. No first farmer, no first scribe, no first builder, just continuation. That silence feels intentional, even if it wasn't. Another possibility is quieter still. What if early civilizations distrusted origins? What if beginnings felt dangerous? After collapse, after displacement, after loss, you don't celebrate where things started. You focus on keeping them going. You record procedures. You preserve measurements. You teach what works, not why it works. That mindset shows up in the tone of the tablets. They feel careful, administrative, grounded, as if someone understood how fragile order could be. At night, fragility feels closer to the surface. We sense how thin the layer of stability really is. How much of our world depends on routines we barely notice. Civilizations might feel that way too. What if the first cities were acts of caution? Not ambition, not conquest, but consolidation, bringing people together to protect knowledge that had already proven vulnerable. If that's true, then the suddenness of early civilization isn't about genius. It's about urgency. Build quickly, organize efficiently, write things down before they vanish again. And maybe that urgency explains something else. Why so many ancient structures align with cycles of time? Stars, seasons, flood patterns. Tracking repetition becomes important when disruption is expected. Calendars aren't just about agriculture, they're about reassurance. Tomorrow will follow yesterday. The river will rise then fall. The sky will repeat itself. After loss, repetition feels safe. It makes you wonder if the first civilizations were less confident than we imagine, not bold pioneers, but careful inheritors, people who knew what could disappear. That perspective changes how myths feel too. Creation stories with trial and error, gods who argue, worlds that fail before stabilizing. Those aren't triumphant narratives. They're cautious ones. They admit imperfection. They acknowledge mistakes, as if whoever told them knew that stability wasn't guaranteed. At night, those stories don't sound like fantasy. They sound like memory trying to stay intact. Maybe that's why so many ancient texts repeat themselves. The same phrases, the same structures. Repetition isn't laziness, it's reinforcement. You repeat what you're afraid of losing. And if the earliest civilizations were remembering something already lost, then repetition would make sense. Not to convince others, but to convince themselves. I'm not here to prove any of this, only to notice how the shape of the record feels, how often it points backward without naming what it points to. What if the first civilizations weren't obsessed with beginnings, because beginnings had already failed them once? The night doesn't rush these questions, it lets them breathe. There's a particular feeling that comes when you realize something important is missing, but you can't tell exactly what it is. Early civilizations feel like that, complete in form, incomplete in explanation. Take writing, for instance. Cuneiform doesn't begin as poetry or storytelling. It begins as record-keeping, grain, labor, measurements, as if the first concern wasn't expression, but preservation. That choice says more than it seems to. When people invent something new, they usually talk about it. They celebrate it. They mythologize the moment. But when people inherit something fragile, they catalog it. They write things down not to show brilliance, but to prevent loss. It makes you wonder if writing itself emerged from anxiety rather than inspiration. What if the first scribes weren't dreaming of literature, but worried that memory alone wasn't enough anymore? That would explain the tone. Early tablets feel practical, almost restrained. They don't linger on wonder. They focus on continuity. Who owes what? Who owns which field? Which temple receives which offering? These aren't questions of discovery. They're questions of survival. And survival usually follows disruption. Another quiet detail often overlooked is how early civilizations organized time. Calendars appear quickly. Astronomical observations are recorded with care, not casually, systematically. Tracking cycles matters most when unpredictability has already caused harm. If you've lived through sudden change, you learn to watch for patterns. You learn to notice when the river rises, when the stars return to the same position, not because it's beautiful, but because it's reliable. There's something unsettling about how much ancient knowledge is oriented around recurrence, floods, seasons, eclipses. It's as if early civilizations were trying to reassure themselves that the world still followed rules, that it wasn't entirely chaotic. What if the drive to understand the sky wasn't curiosity, but comfort? Looking up at something that still moved predictably when the ground beneath you had once failed. Another possibility slips in quietly. What if the people who built the first cities didn't fully understand the systems they were maintaining? What if they inherited techniques without the original reasoning behind them? That happens more often than we admit. We follow traditions without knowing why they began. We use technologies without understanding their origins. We trust because the system works, not because we remember how it was created. If that was true in the distant past, then early civilizations may have been caretakers of knowledge already partially detached from its source. They wouldn't explain origins because they couldn't. They only knew that certain things had to be done a certain way. Irrigation channels needed specific gradients, calendars needed specific divisions, measurements needed consistency. The why may have already been lost. At night, that idea feels familiar. We inherit a world built by people we never met, using ideas shaped by events we never experienced. We live inside structures of memory without realizing it. Civilizations might do the same. That perspective changes how we read ancient myths too. Instead of asking whether they are true or false, we can ask what they were trying to hold together. Flood stories appear across cultures, not identical, but recognizable. A world before, a world after. Survivors who carry something forward. Those stories don't feel like explanations of geology. They feel like emotional landmarks, markers of discontinuity, ways of saying things were different once, And maybe that's all memory can do across long stretches of time. It doesn't preserve detail. It preserves feeling, loss, urgency, the sense that something mattered. If the first civilizations were remembering something already lost, then what they preserved wouldn't be facts. It would be structure, ways of organizing life that had once worked, ways of avoiding chaos. Writing would lock those structures in place, even as their origins faded. There's something quiet and human in that. Not heroic, not mystical, just careful. And maybe that's why the earliest civilizations don't feel naive. They feel cautious, as if they already knew how quickly things could unravel, as if they weren't optimistic about the future, but determined to stabilize it. That determination leaves a particular texture in the historical record, a seriousness, a lack of experimentation, no visible phase of trying things out, only application. That absence can be unsettling, but it can also be gentle. It suggests that the people who built the first cities weren't obsessed with being first. They were focused on not being last. At night, that shift matters. It pulls us away from spectacle and toward continuity, away from grand claims and toward quiet responsibility. I'm not here to say this is what happened, only to notice how well it fits the shape of what remains, how the record feels less like a birth announcement and more like a note left behind, something written quickly, carefully, in case someone later wondered how things were supposed to work. What if the first civilizations weren't celebrating their arrival in history, but trying to make sure history didn't erase them again? The night deepens, and the questions grow softer, not heavier, just quieter. There's a certain calm that comes when you stop expecting the past to explain itself, when you let it be incomplete. Civilizations leave behind structures, not intentions. Stones, clay, patterns. We infer purpose afterward, and maybe that's where unease enters. Because when we look closely at the earliest civilizations, we don't see curiosity driving them forward. We see caution holding them together. The cities are dense, organized, carefully divided. Space is regulated. Labor is accounted for. Time is segmented. These are not the priorities of people experimenting with new ways of living. They are the priorities of people who know what disorder looks like. What if the first cities weren't expressions of growth, but responses to vulnerability? Crowding together makes sense after dispersal. Walls make sense after exposure. Rules make sense after chaos. And writing makes sense after forgetting. It's easy to imagine writing as a breakthrough, a leap forward, but at night it feels more like a safety net, something you build when you don't trust memory alone anymore. There's something unsettling about how early writing focuses on the present tense, on what is owed now, what exists now, rarely on what came before, as if looking back too far felt unstable, or unnecessary, or painful. If knowledge had already been fractured once, you wouldn't want to trace its path backward. You'd want to anchor it here. Another quiet detail often overlooked is how early civilizations viewed authority. Kingship is described as something received, not earned, not invented. It arrives, it descends, it returns. That language is strange. Power usually justifies itself through conquest or lineage, but here it's framed as restoration, as if legitimacy comes from continuity, not innovation. What if leadership itself was seen as a responsibility to preserve order, rather than a right to reshape it? That would align with everything else we see. Stable systems, fixed rituals, reverence for repetition. Not because repetition is sacred, but because change had consequences once before. At night, repetition feels like breathing, in, out. You don't question it, you just trust it. Civilizations might breathe the same way. Rituals repeated across generations, measurements reused, stories told again and again, not to entertain but to regulate. And maybe that's why the myths don't rush to clarify themselves. They're not instructions, they're containers. They hold emotion more than information, fear, loss, relief. If a catastrophe existed in deep memory, and whether local or widespread, then myth would be the safest way to carry it. Not as data, but as feeling. Feeling survives when facts don't. It makes you wonder whether we've been asking the wrong questions. Instead of asking, did this really happen? We might ask, why did this story need to survive? Why did it matter enough to repeat? Floods appear again and again in ancient narratives. Not because water is dramatic, but because erasure is. Floods erase boundaries, records, markers of ownership. They reset landscapes. After that, memory becomes the most fragile thing, and fragile things get protected. Maybe that's what early civilizations were doing, protecting memory by turning it into structure, into cities, into calendars, into law. Structures are harder to wash away than stories alone, but even structures don't explain themselves. They just exist. So here we are, thousands of years later, standing among remains that work too well for their age. And we keep asking, how did they do this? When maybe the better question is, why were they so careful? Why did they organize life so precisely, so early? Why does everything feel like it's already been thought through? Because careful thinking usually follows consequence. At night, consequences feel closer than causes. We don't replay how something began. We replay how it failed. Civilizations might remember the same way, and if that's true, then the earliest cities aren't puzzles to solve. They're responses to something we no longer see, like scars without stories. The skin heals, the structure remains, only the origin fades. I'm not here to claim there was a lost world or a forgotten golden age, only to notice how often the record behaves as if something mattered enough to protect, something worth stabilizing. What if the first civilizations were not confident in progress, but cautious about survival? What if their greatest innovation wasn't technology, but memory management, finding ways to keep things from disappearing again? At night, that idea doesn't feel dramatic. It feels gentle, almost understandable. We do the same thing when we write things down we don't want to forget. Names, dates, moments. Not because they explain everything, but because losing them would feel worse. Maybe the first civilizations were doing exactly that, writing not to define the past, but to keep it from slipping away completely. And maybe that's why, when we read their records, we feel that quiet sense of absence, not because something is being hidden, but because something had already gone. The night holds this thought gently now, not insisting, just allowing it to linger. When you step back and look at the earliest civilizations as a whole, there's a strange emotional tone beneath the stone and clay. It isn't triumph, it isn't wonder, it feels careful. The first cities don't seem eager to experiment with social life. They regulate it. Roles are defined early. Priests, scribes, laborers, kings, duties assigned, offerings scheduled, boundaries measured. It's the architecture of restraint. Restraint usually follows loss. What if the earliest civilizations weren't discovering how to live together, but trying to prevent something from breaking apart again? That possibility sits quietly beneath the ruins. Take temples, for example. They appear very early, often before palaces, not just as places of worship, but as storage centers, redistribution hubs, administrative cores, grain stored, goods tallied, labor organized. Temples weren't escapes from reality. They were anchors within it. If survival once depended on cooperation, then centralizing resources would feel essential, and centralizing memory would too. Writing, ritual, architecture, all working together to create continuity. It makes you wonder if religion itself, in its earliest form, was less about belief and more about preservation, preserving rhythms, preserving obligations, preserving shared meaning. When something fragile survives catastrophe, it often becomes sacred. Not because it's mystical, but because losing it again would be unbearable. That might explain the reverence embedded in early texts, not awe at creation, but fear of collapse. Another detail quietly supports this. Early civilizations are deeply concerned with order versus chaos, balance versus disruption, cosmic order, social order, legal order. These themes repeat constantly, but they don't feel abstract. They feel practical, as if disorder wasn't theoretical, as if it had already been experienced. At night, we tend to replay disruptions more than beginnings. We remember storms more vividly than calm days, loss more sharply than arrival. Civilizations might remember the same way. If something ended abruptly in the deep past, then everything afterward would be shaped by that ending. The need to keep things aligned, measured, predictable, calendars, laws, boundaries, all of them ways of saying, this is how things stay intact. And maybe that's why the earliest civilizations feel emotionally different from later empires. Later empires expand, conquer, innovate. They boast. Early civilizations don't boast. They document, they list, they preserve, as if their primary concern wasn't growth, but continuity. What if the true innovation of early civilization wasn't technology at all? What if it was restraint, the decision to limit variation, to standardize practice, to reduce risk? That kind of thinking doesn't come from optimism. It comes from memory, from knowing that complexity can unravel. And if that's the case, then the absence of origin stories makes sense. You don't celebrate origins when they feel unstable. You focus on maintenance. Beginnings are unpredictable. Continuity is safer. That might be why the earliest texts feel emotionally flat to modern readers. They don't dramatize. They don't explain. They ensure. And maybe that's why when we read them at night, something feels unfinished. Because we're expecting explanation, and they're offering stability instead. They weren't writing for us. They were writing for themselves, for future scribes, for future builders, for people who might forget. That's a quiet act of care, one that doesn't demand belief, only repetition. I'm not here to suggest that everything before civilization was lost in a single event, only to notice how much early civilization behaves as if loss was already part of its memory. That behavior doesn't require a global catastrophe, only vulnerability, only the awareness that things can end. At night, that awareness feels natural. We don't fear tomorrow because it's unknown. We fear it because we've seen things change before. Civilizations may carry that same quiet caution forward, and maybe that's why the earliest civilizations feel both advanced and restrained. They weren't rushing toward the future. They were stabilizing the present, holding it still long enough to pass it on. If something had already slipped away once, then holding on would feel urgent, and that urgency wouldn't look dramatic. It would look like order, like lists, like schedules, like clay tablets pressed carefully, deliberately, marks made slowly so they wouldn't fade. What if the first civilizations were less concerned with telling us where humanity began, and more concerned with making sure it didn't forget how to continue? That question doesn't demand an answer. It just sits there, quietly, like the ruins themselves, waiting for us to stop asking them to explain and start listening to what their silence already suggests. The night feels steadier now, as if the questions have found their rhythm. Not answers, just movement. There's a subtle shift that happens when you stop looking at early civilizations as achievements and start seeing them as responses. Responses don't announce themselves. They adjust. They tighten what feels loose. They reinforce what feels fragile. That might be why the earliest civilizations feel so composed. Even their art is controlled, stylized, symbolic, rarely chaotic. Symbols repeat, forms persist, repetition again. It's easy to mistake repetition for lack of imagination. But repetition is often the opposite. It's imagination restrained by memory. If something once fell apart, you don't reinvent freely. You conserve, you narrow variation, you standardize. What if the reason early civilizations appear so complete is because they intentionally limited deviation? That kind of thinking feels familiar at night. When you've been through disruption, you don't want surprises. You want predictability. Predictability becomes comfort. Civilizations may have learned that early, and maybe that's why so much ancient knowledge feels strangely conservative. Measurements fixed, units repeated, rituals preserved exactly, even mistakes are copied. Later scribes reproduce earlier texts word for word, symbol for symbol, even when the meaning becomes unclear. That detail matters. They weren't updating. They weren't optimizing. They were preserving, sometimes preserving things they no longer fully understood. Which raises another quiet possibility. What if parts of early civilization functioned like inherited tools whose original purpose had faded? A calendar still used long after the event that inspired it. A ritual performed long after its initial context was forgotten. We do this all the time. We celebrate dates without remembering why they mattered. We repeat phrases whose origins are lost. Meaning shifts, but structure remains. If that happened on a civilizational scale, then what we see in early history might be the echo of something older, not clearly remembered, but still shaping behavior. That would explain why certain questions feel unanswered in the record, Not because someone hid the answers, but because they didn't have them anymore. They had outcomes, they had systems, but not stories of origin. At night, that absence feels honest. Memory doesn't preserve beginnings well, it preserves endings. We remember what broke, what was lost, and we build around that. Early civilizations might be architectures of avoidance. Avoid this mistake. Avoid that failure. Don't let the water rise unchecked. Don't let food distribution become uneven. Don't let social roles dissolve. Rules emerge where chaos once entered. If that's the case, then the first cities aren't monuments to progress. They're monuments to restraint. And restraint rarely announces itself. It works quietly. That quietness might be why we feel unsettled reading ancient records. We expect triumph. We find maintenance. We expect mythic beginnings. We find administrative care. And that contrast creates a gap we don't know how to fill. So we fill it with speculation, with lost continents, with forgotten empires. Those ideas may or may not be true, but the feeling that generates them is real. The feeling that something important isn't being said. Not because it was secret, but because it was already slipping out of reach. There's something deeply human about that. We write journals when we feel memory thinning. We take photographs when moments feel fleeting. Writing itself might be an act of anticipation of forgetting. So what if the first civilizations wrote because they sensed fragility? Not of knowledge, but of continuity. They felt how easily things could dissolve, and writing was their way of holding things still. That would mean the first written words weren't celebratory. They were protective. They weren't declarations of identity. They were safeguards. At night, safeguards matter more than declarations. We lock doors. We double-check lights. Not because we expect danger, but because we remember it's possible. Civilizations may behave the same way, and if so, then the earliest civilizations weren't looking forward. They were bracing against loss. Which might explain why when we look for the start of civilization, it feels misplaced. Beginnings don't leave behind this kind of evidence. Rebuilding does, reorganization does, stabilization does. What if civilization didn't begin with inspiration, but with recovery? Not recovery from a single dramatic event necessarily, but recovery from instability, from learning, slowly, that things don't last on their own, that they need reinforcement. At night, that realization doesn't feel bleak. It feels grounding, because it suggests continuity isn't accidental, it's chosen again and again, by people who may not have known exactly what they were preserving, but knew it mattered. They pressed that knowing into clay, carefully, deliberately, so that someone later, maybe someone like us, would feel the weight of it, not as certainty, but as presence, a quiet sense that something came before, and someone tried very hard not to let it vanish completely. I'm not here to decide what that something was, only to sit with the feeling it left behind, and to notice how often the earlier civilizations feel less like origins and more like careful hands holding onto something fragile in the dark. The quiet feels familiar now, like a place you've already been tonight, not because the questions are answered, but because they've settled into something steady. There's a moment that happens when you stop asking what started everything and start asking what was someone afraid of losing. That shift changes how the earliest civilizations look. The obsession with measurement becomes clearer. Lengths, volumes, time. Precision isn't curiosity. Precision is care. You measure carefully when error has consequences. The base 60 system the Sumerians used isn't just clever. It's practical, divisible, flexible. It works well in a world where coordination matters. And coordination matters when people rely on one another to survive. What if these systems weren't designed in moments of inspiration, but refined through necessity, not invented once, but carried forward because they worked? That would explain why they appear without explanation. You don't explain a tool everyone already depends on. You just keep using it. At night, that idea feels intuitive. We don't explain why we breathe a certain way. We just do. Civilizations may inherit behaviors the same way. Another subtle detail sits quietly in the background. Early civilizations don't seem particularly interested in novelty. They don't chase constant change. They resist it. Later cultures innovate aggressively. They expand, they rewrite. But early civilizations consolidate. They standardize brick sizes. They formalize laws. They lock calendars into place. That's not the mindset of people discovering possibilities. It's the mindset of people limiting risk. Limitation becomes a form of wisdom. What if the greatest fear in early civilization wasn't ignorance, but instability? Instability threatens memory. It disrupts continuity. And continuity seems to be the quiet priority running through everything. That would also explain the emotional tone of early myth. The gods are not distant creators. They are administrators, managers, judges. They organize, they regulate, they argue over labor, over responsibility. These aren't cosmic fairy tales. They sound like reflections of real social concerns. Who maintains order? Who bears the burden? What happens when balance is lost? Those questions don't emerge at the beginning of social life. They emerge after stress, after something strains the system. At night, stress leaves a residue. We don't always remember the event clearly. We remember how it made us behave afterward, more cautious, more structured, more alert. Civilizations may remember the same way. That would mean myths are less about explaining the universe and more about explaining why certain rules exist, why certain roles matter, why disorder feels dangerous. And if that's true, then the absence of clear origin stories becomes meaningful, not a failure, a consequence. When you inherit something essential but fragile, you don't ask where it came from. You ask how to keep it working. The earliest civilizations might not have seen themselves as pioneers. They might have seen themselves as caretakers. Caretakers don't seek credit. They seek continuity. That's a quiet role, one that doesn't leave behind dramatic explanations, only systems that endure. Another thought surfaces gently. What if the reason we struggle to locate a clear start of civilization is because civilization isn't an event? What if it's a posture, a way of responding to vulnerability, a decision to organize life tightly enough that it survives disruption? If that's the case, then civilization could emerge whenever fragility is recognized. Not once, not in one place, but wherever people sense that memory needs reinforcement. Writing then becomes inevitable, not as art, but as insurance. Insurance against forgetting, against misalignment, against loss. At night, insurance feels comforting. You don't expect disaster, but you prepare for it. Civilizations may have done the same, and that preparation would leave behind exactly what we find. Carefully ordered ruins, meticulously copied texts, systems that work without explaining themselves, a record that feels confident but quiet. That quietness isn't emptiness, it's restraint, the kind that comes from knowing that chaos doesn't announce itself. It arrives suddenly, so you build slowly, deliberately. You repeat what works. You avoid unnecessary change. You protect continuity even when you don't fully understand its origin. If the first civilizations were remembering something already lost, then what survives isn't the memory of the loss itself. It's the behavior shaped by it, the carefulness, the precision, the insistence on order. Those things linger long after stories fade. At night, that feels human. We carry habits shaped by experiences we barely remember. We build routines around absences we can't name. Civilizations may do the same, and maybe that's why standing among ancient ruins feels strangely intimate. Not because they reveal secrets, but because they feel familiar, like walking into a room arranged by someone who wanted things to stay the same, someone who cared. I'm not here to say there was a single forgotten world or one lost beginning, only to notice how much early civilization behaves as if continuity mattered deeply, perhaps more deeply than origin, and how that behavior leaves behind a record that invites reflection rather than certainty. What if the earliest civilizations weren't asking where humanity began, but how it could avoid disappearing again? That question doesn't need an answer to matter. It only needs space, and the night is very good at giving it that. The night stretches gently onward, as if it isn't measuring time anymore, just holding it. There's a point in these reflections where the idea of lost starts to feel different, not dramatic, not catastrophic, more like something set down quietly and never fully picked back up. When we imagine loss, we often imagine destruction, fire, water, collapse. But loss can also happen through distance, through generations, through the slow fading of context. Early civilizations may not have lost everything at once. They may have lost understanding first. the reasons behind practices, the stories behind systems. What remains when understanding fades isn't confusion. It's ritual. You continue doing what works, even when you forget why it works. That pattern appears everywhere in the ancient world. Calendars maintained long after their original astronomical significance is forgotten. Rituals repeated even when their symbolic meaning becomes unclear. Architectural forms preserved even when their original function shifts. That isn't stagnation. It's memory trying to survive without explanation. At night, memory behaves the same way. We remember how to feel before we remember why we felt that way. If early civilizations were shaped by experiences that predated writing, then writing wouldn't capture those experiences. It would capture their consequences. That distinction matters. We keep looking for descriptions of the event, when what survived was the response, and responses don't explain themselves, they just repeat. This might be why the earliest civilizations feel emotionally subdued, not exuberant, not exploratory. Grounded, as if the goal wasn't expansion but equilibrium. Equilibrium is fragile. You only seek it when imbalance has already taught you its cost. What if the earliest civilizations were built by people who understood that stability wasn't guaranteed, not philosophically, but practically? People who knew that rivers could change course, that climate could shift, that social cohesion could fracture. Those lessons don't need to be written down to shape behavior. They shape priorities. Order over novelty, preservation over invention, continuity over explanation. When we read early records with that lens, their silence begins to feel intentional rather than empty. They aren't avoiding origins, they're bypassing them, because origins aren't actionable. What's actionable is knowing what keeps things intact. There's something deeply nocturnal about that mindset. At night, we don't plan bold futures. We secure the present. We lock doors. We check windows. We make sure what exists will still be there in the morning. Civilizations may do the same when they sense vulnerability. That would mean the first cities weren't statements of confidence. They were shelters. Not just physical shelters, but cultural ones. Places where practices could be reinforced, where knowledge could be centralized, where memory could be standardized. Standardization itself becomes a form of protection. When everyone does things the same way, fewer things fall through the cracks. Uniform bricks, uniform measures, uniform rituals. Uniformity isn't about control at first, it's about reliability. And reliability matters most when unpredictability has already caused harm. Another quiet thread emerges here. What if the reason early civilizations appear so abruptly in the archaeological record is because earlier forms were intentionally replaced, not erased violently, but reorganized? Small scattered settlements consolidated into dense centers, local traditions absorbed into standardized systems. That process would leave behind a sense of suddenness, not because nothing existed before, but because what existed before was transformed rather than continued. Transformation often looks like disappearance from a distance, especially across thousands of years. If that's true, then the start of civilization isn't a birth. It's a compression. Many streams pulled into one channel. That channel feels sudden, defined, structured, and it carries traces of what flowed into it without preserving their individual sources. At night, rivers are hard to trace. You hear movement, you feel direction, but origins blur. Maybe history does too, and maybe that's why the question of beginnings feels so unresolved, because what we're calling a beginning is really a convergence, a moment when memory, necessity, and restraint aligned, and when that alignment happened, writing emerged. Not as storytelling, as stabilization. The earliest written words aren't poetic, they're procedural. They don't ask questions, they maintain order. That alone tells us something about the emotional climate of the time. This wasn't a culture intoxicated by novelty. It was a culture focused on durability. Durability is quiet. It doesn't announce itself, it just persists, which brings us back to the feeling that started all of this. That sense that the first civilizations weren't explaining the world, they were holding it together. If something had already been lost, whether through flood, migration, fragmentation, or slow forgetting, then what survived wouldn't be clarity. It would be structure. Structure survives longer than stories. And maybe that's why, when we listen carefully, the ancient world doesn't sound like it's speaking to us. It sounds like it's steadying itself, breathing, repeating, enduring. I'm not here to uncover what was lost, only to sit with the possibility that something mattered enough to protect, even when its origin could no longer be clearly named. What if the first civilizations weren't trying to tell us where humanity came from, but trying to make sure it had somewhere to continue? That thought doesn't need resolution, it only needs space, and the night has plenty of that. The night feels wider now, not deeper, just open enough to let the idea breathe. There's a strange comfort in realizing that forgetting doesn't always look like loss. Sometimes it looks like routine. The oldest civilizations don't feel confused. They feel practiced, as if people knew exactly what needed to be done, even if they no longer remembered why it mattered in the first place. That kind of knowing is quiet, inherited, unquestioned. You see it in how early societies trained their scribes, not as innovators, as copyists. Learning meant repetition, accuracy, faithfulness to older forms. Mistakes weren't tolerated. Variation wasn't encouraged. The goal wasn't improvement, it was preservation. That detail lingers. When a culture prioritizes copying over creativity, it usually means something is considered too important to alter, something fragile. If early civilizations were remembering something already lost, then exactness would feel essential. Change would feel risky. At night, risk feels louder than possibility. We don't experiment when we're tired. We rely on what we trust. Civilizations might behave the same way under pressure. Another subtle clue lives in how early societies understood authority over knowledge. Knowledge wasn't open. It was guarded. Temples controlled calendars. Scribes controlled writing. Priests interpreted omens. This isn't about secrecy for power's sake alone. It's about preventing drift. When too many versions exist, coherence weakens. And coherence may have been the thing they feared losing most. What if the earliest civilizations didn't fear ignorance, but fragmentation? Fragmentation of memory, fragmentation of practice. If something had already scattered once, then gathering it tightly would feel necessary. So knowledge became centralized, codified, protected. That protection doesn't look like enlightenment. It looks like caution, and caution often carries the echo of prior harm. It makes you wonder whether the idea of progress even made sense to the earliest civilizations. Progress implies direction, movement forward, but their systems don't point forward. They point inward, toward balance, toward repetition, toward holding a moment steady. At night, holding things steady feels more important than moving ahead. We want the present to last until morning. Civilizations may want the same, and if that's true, then the earliest cities weren't optimistic experiments. They were shelters built against uncertainty. Shelters don't explain the storm that led to their construction. They just exist. So when we search the ancient record for explanations of origin and don't find them, maybe that absence isn't a failure of history. Maybe it's a feature of recovery. Recovery doesn't revisit trauma in detail. It rebuilds around it. Another quiet realization surfaces here. What if the reason the first civilizations feel so advanced is because we're seeing the survivors of a longer process, not the full spectrum, just what endured? Fragile experiments don't survive thousands of years. Robust systems do. So what we call sudden appearance may simply be selective visibility. Only what worked remained. Only what could be maintained long-term entered the record. That alone can create the illusion of abruptness. At night, memory works the same way. We remember the strongest moments, the routines that stuck. The failed attempts fade first. So perhaps early civilizations weren't unusually fast to develop. Perhaps they were unusually good at keeping what worked, and that skill would itself feel inherited. You don't stumble into durability by accident. Durability is learned, often the hard way. This brings the thought back to loss again, not as a single event, but as a condition. Loss of certainty, loss of context, loss of continuity. Those losses don't need to be dramatic to shape behavior. They just need to be felt. And once felt, they don't go away easily. They turn into habits, into systems, into quiet rules that no one questions anymore. That's how civilizations might carry memory forward without remembering its source, which would explain why the ancient world often feels like it's speaking in echoes, not statements, not declarations, just patterns, patterns repeated until they become invisible. And when we look for beginnings inside patterns, we get frustrated. Patterns don't tell you where they started. They tell you what they do. The earliest civilizations may have been less concerned with telling stories and more concerned with keeping patterns intact, because patterns survive even when stories don't. At night, patterns feel grounding, breathing, heartbeat, the slow rhythm of thought. Civilizations may have anchored themselves the same way, through repetition, through order, through systems designed not to inspire, but to endure. If something important had already been lost, whether knowledge, people, or stability, then endurance would feel sacred, not because it was divine, but because it was rare. And perhaps that's the quiet truth beneath the ancient record. Not that the past is hiding secrets, but that it is protecting continuity, protecting it so well that it forgot to explain itself along the way. That kind of forgetting doesn't erase meaning. It reshapes it. Meaning becomes function, purpose becomes habit, and habit becomes civilization. So maybe the first civilizations weren't asking the question we keep asking. They weren't asking, where did we come from? They were asking, how do we keep this from falling apart again? That question leaves behind a very different kind of evidence, evidence that feels complete but unfinished, stable but quiet. I'm not here to fill that quiet with answers, only to sit with it. To notice how often the earliest civilizations feel less like beginnings and more like careful pauses, moments where humanity stopped, looked around and decided to hold on, just long enough. The night feels quieter than before, not because the thoughts are fading, but because they've settled into something steady. There's a moment when you realize that continuity itself can become invisible. When something works for long enough, no one questions it anymore. That may be what we're sensing when we look at the first civilizations. Not mystery, familiarity. A familiarity so old that its origins no longer mattered. Early societies didn't seem preoccupied with novelty. They weren't asking what could be added, they were asking what could be maintained. And maintenance leaves a different kind of trace. It leaves order without explanation. That might be why so many ancient systems feel complete but emotionally restrained. They function. They endure. They don't persuade. They don't need to. If early civilizations were shaped by the quiet knowledge that things can unravel, then persuasion would be unnecessary. Survival would be enough. There's something deeply nocturnal about that realization. At night, we don't argue with ourselves. We accept what keeps us steady. We don't demand origin stories from our routines. We trust them because they work. Civilizations may do the same. This might explain why the earliest cities seem less curious about their own past than we are. They didn't document beginnings. They documented responsibilities. Who must bring grain? Who must tend canals? Who must perform rituals? Those are not philosophical questions, they are practical ones. And practical thinking often follows disruption. You don't worry about structure until structure has failed you once. That failure doesn't need to be remembered clearly. Its effect lingers. It shapes behavior. It shapes priorities. It shapes what gets written down. So perhaps the reason the earliest civilizations don't tell us how humanity began is because that question wasn't relevant to their situation. What mattered was continuity, and continuity doesn't look backward. It looks inward, at what must be repeated, at what must not change. That inward focus might be why early civilizations feel almost timeless. Their systems don't evolve quickly. They stabilize. And stability feels slow, especially from the outside. From thousands of years away, we expect motion, we find stillness, and stillness unsettles us, because stillness suggests restraint. Restraint suggests memory, memory of something that taught caution. Another thought drifts in quietly. What if the reason we feel compelled to speculate about lost worlds and forgotten epochs isn't because the past is hiding something, but because the past is too calm? Its calmness feels earned. As if something intense happened before the calm arrived. We instinctively search for what preceded it, the storm before the quiet. But storms don't always leave records, especially if the record keepers come later. They inherit the aftermath, not the event. That doesn't make them deceptive, it makes them human. They worked with what they had. They preserved what remained. They didn't invent narratives to fill gaps. They focused on keeping life aligned. That restraint might be the most telling thing of all. People who haven't experienced loss tend to speculate freely. They imagine. People who have experienced loss tend to simplify. They reduce variables. They limit risk. Early civilizations feel simplified in that way. Elegant, structured, not experimental. And maybe that's why later civilizations feel so different. Once stability is secured for long enough, confidence returns. Innovation accelerates. Stories become bolder. Origins get mythologized. But at the very beginning of writing, there's restraint, almost humility, as if the people pressing those first marks into clay didn't feel entitled to explain everything. They felt responsible for preserving something. That responsibility doesn't require certainty. It requires care. And care leaves a specific emotional imprint, one that feels quiet even thousands of years later. At night, quietness feels honest. It doesn't demand belief. It invites attention, which might be why these ancient records continue to draw us in, not because they reveal answers, but because they withhold them without defensiveness. They don't claim authority over truth. They simply exist, like routines passed down through families. You don't ask where they began, you accept that they matter, and you keep them going. If the first civilizations were remembering something already lost, then what we see isn't evidence of forgotten grandeur. It's evidence of remembered fragility. Fragility makes people careful. Careful people build systems. Systems outlast stories, and stories outlast memory. So perhaps what survives isn't the beginning of civilization, but its response to vulnerability. A response that didn't need to be explained, only repeated. That idea doesn't close anything. It opens something softer, a way of sitting with the past without forcing it to speak, without demanding it justify itself. I'm not here to say what was lost or when or how, only to notice how often the earliest civilizations behave as if continuity mattered more than origin, and how that behavior feels less like mystery and more like quiet recognition. Recognition that some things once gone can only be carried forward indirectly, through habit, through structure, through repetition. The night understands that kind of carrying. It doesn't rush memory, it lets it rest. What if the first civilizations weren't trying to tell us where everything began, but trusting that what mattered most would survive through practice alone? The night feels almost still now, not silent, just settled. There's a point where the idea of beginnings stops feeling urgent, where the need to trace a line backward softens into something quieter. Acceptance, maybe, or recognition. When something has lasted long enough, its origin becomes less important than its presence. That might be the emotional posture of the earliest civilizations. They didn't look backward with nostalgia. They didn't look forward with ambition. They looked inward, at balance, at order, at what needed to be done tomorrow. There's something striking about how early records focus on obligation. Who owes labor? Who owes grain? Who owes service to the temple? Obligation implies dependence, and dependence implies awareness that things can fail. You don't formalize obligation in a world you believe will take care of itself. You do it when you've seen what happens when it doesn't. At night, obligation feels heavier than curiosity. Curiosity belongs to daylight. Obligation belongs to continuity. Civilizations may have learned that early. Another quiet detail sits beneath everything we've been circling. Early civilizations don't seem particularly interested in explaining why their world is ordered the way it is. They accept the order as given. That acceptance feels different from ignorance. It feels deliberate, as if asking too many why questions might destabilize something fragile. When stability is new, you don't question it, you protect it. That instinct doesn't require fear, just memory. Memory of imbalance, memory of uncertainty, even if that memory is no longer conscious. If the first civilizations were remembering something already lost, then questioning origins might have felt risky. Better to focus on what keeps things working. Better to maintain alignment than to reopen old questions. That doesn't mean the questions didn't exist. It means they weren't prioritized, which brings another thought quietly into focus. What if the reason we feel compelled to fill the gaps in early history is because those gaps were intentionally left unfilled, not hidden, not censored, simply not pursued, because pursuing them didn't help the present? That kind of restraint feels unfamiliar to us. We're trained to value explanation, to believe that understanding origins gives us control. But control isn't always what people want after disruption. Sometimes they want predictability. And predictability comes from repetition, not inquiry. The earliest civilizations might have understood that instinctively. They created systems that could be taught without explanation. You don't need to know where a calendar came from to use it. You don't need to know why a measurement works to apply it. You only need consistency. Consistency creates trust. Trust creates continuity. At night, trust matters more than knowledge. We trust the bed to hold us, the dark to stay quiet. We don't analyze those things, we accept them. Civilizations might do the same with their inherited systems. That acceptance could easily be mistaken for confidence, but it might actually be humility. Humility in the face of things too old, too complex, or too fragile to fully explain. Humility shows up as silence, and silence can look like mystery from the outside, but from the inside, it may feel like care. Care not to disturb what's holding everything together. If that's the case, then the earliest civilizations weren't hiding their origins. They were setting them aside, not because they didn't matter, but because something else mattered more. Survival, stability, continuation. Those priorities leave behind a particular emotional residue, one that feels calm but serious, one that doesn't invite spectacle, one that resists interpretation, which may be why modern minds feel unsettled by the ancient record. We expect explanation, we find maintenance, we expect mythic beginnings, we find routines, and we fill the gap with speculation because we're uncomfortable with silence. But silence doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes it means presence without commentary. The kind of presence you don't need to explain. If the first civilizations were remembering something already lost, then perhaps the most important thing they preserved wasn't knowledge. It was posture, a way of relating to the world. Careful, measured, attentive. That posture survives in the architecture of their lives, in how they organized space, in how they measured time, in how they repeated what worked, even when they no longer remembered why it worked. At night, posture feels more real than narrative. We don't tell ourselves stories to fall asleep. We adjust how we lie. Civilizations may settle into the same kind of knowing, a knowing that doesn't need words. So maybe the reason the first civilizations feel so complete is because they weren't searching. They were holding practices together, holding communities together, holding time together. That kind of holding doesn't announce itself. It simply endures. And endurance is easy to overlook, until it's gone. I'm not here to claim that something specific was lost before civilization began, only to notice how strongly early civilization seems shaped by the awareness that things can be lost. That awareness doesn't produce drama, it produces care. And care leaves behind a quiet kind of evidence, one that asks us not to solve it, but to sit with it, to let the silence remain intact. What if the first civilizations weren't inviting us to uncover their beginnings, but trusting that what mattered most would survive without explanation? That thought doesn't need certainty, it just needs patience. And the night is patient. The night doesn't ask anything more from this thought, it lets it rest. There's a quiet clarity that comes when you stop expecting the past to resolve itself, when you allow it to remain partially unfinished, not broken, just incomplete. Maybe that's what we're really sensing when we look at the first civilizations. Not a missing chapter, but a pause. A moment where humanity stopped trying to explain everything and focused instead on holding something steady. We often imagine history as a forward-moving line, beginnings leading to middles, middles leading to ends. But early civilization doesn't feel linear, it feels anchored, as if people chose to stand still long enough for continuity to take shape. That choice doesn't leave behind dramatic stories, it leaves behind systems. Systems that work quietly, systems that don't explain themselves, systems that survive. If something had already been lost, knowledge, stability, context, then explanation might have felt secondary. What mattered was alignment. Fields watered at the right time, calendars followed, rituals repeated, not because they were sacred in themselves, but because they held life together. There's something deeply human in that. When something fragile matters, we don't overthink it. We protect it. We repeat what works. We avoid unnecessary change. We trust the pattern. The earliest civilizations may not have known exactly what they were preserving, but they knew it mattered. And maybe that's enough. At night, we don't need full stories to feel grounded. We need rhythm, consistency, the reassurance that something will still be there when we wake. civilizations might seek the same comfort. If the first cities feel complete but emotionally restrained, if the records feel precise but quiet, if the myths feel cautious rather than triumphant, maybe that's not because something is missing. Maybe it's because something had already been carried through loss and didn't need to be explained anymore. Memory doesn't always survive as information. Sometimes it survives as behavior, as posture, as care, as restraint. And restraint doesn't speak loudly. It just holds. So when we ask whether the first civilizations were remembering something already lost, we don't need to imagine a single vanished world or a hidden truth waiting to be uncovered. It may be simpler than that. They may have remembered vulnerability. They may have remembered that things don't last on their own, and they responded by building systems meant to endure longer than stories. Clay instead of voice, routine instead of speculation, structure instead of explanation. That response doesn't demand belief. It only asks for attention, for patience, for the willingness to sit with silence without trying to fill it. I'm not here to prove anything, only to think with you. And tonight, it feels enough to notice that the earliest civilizations don't sound like beginnings. They sound like hands steadying something fragile in the dark, quietly, carefully, so that it might last.